So in today's scripture, Jesus predicted the end of the world. I don't know if you were listening very carefully, you might have caught it. And when Jesus predicted the end of the world, his audience knew it. Jesus said that he would die, and then he would rise, and that he would soon after that come again with angels to judge the world. And actually, a few chapters later in Mark, Jesus said that the sun was going to be darkened one day soon, and the stars were going to fall from heaven, and then before this generation passes away, Jesus said he was going to return on the clouds. This is what the earliest Christians believed. The Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 7 to the virgins in his church who were considering marriage. Paul said, in view of the impending crises, by which he meant the return of Jesus, in view of the impending crises, it would be well for you to remain as you are. And Paul meant, you probably shouldn't get married because Jesus is coming soon. Which must have made for some old single men and spinsters, or whatever you call them, in Paul's church, because Jesus didn't come back. Jesus did not come to judge the living and the dead within that generation's lifetime. Still, Christians in general have never tired of predicting the end of the world. All such predictions, however, inclusive of dates and what it would look like, all such predictions from people like the early Christian theologian Montanus through the famous Sir Isaac Newton to today's Jehovah's Witnesses, all these people who predicted the end of the world were wrong. But now, what's interesting to me is that the end of the world has also become not just a religious fascination, but it has become a secular and even scientific fascination. Consider Margaret Atwood, all by herself. You know, she's written The Handmaid's Tale about what happens in the United States after a nuclear war. It's an award-winning TV show on Hulu. And she's written a follow-up book, The Testaments, which has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And actually my favorite Atwood books are the Mad Adam trilogy, which she wrote in the 2010s. And that's a trilogy of books about a world destroyed by climate change and genetic engineering and pharmaceutical malpractice. Post-apocalyptic end-of-the-world fiction is really big right now. There's Cormac McCarthy's On the Road, there's the Hunger Game trilogy and movies, there's Station 11, all of Hugh Howey's young adult novels that are all the rage among young people right now, Stephen King movies like World War Z and Resident Evil with their zombies, and the Mad Max franchise. Some of us are of an age where we even remember the first one coming out. The Deep Impact, Armageddon, TV's Walking Dead, and so on. People are fascinated by the end of the world. Studying the end of the world has also become an academic discipline. So, for example, this week I read Brian Walsh, who summarizes the academic world of the end of the world in a book entitled End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World. Walsh writes, it could be an asteroid that ends life as we know it. Well, as you probably know, this has happened before. About 66 million years ago, a 6-mile-wide asteroid slammed into the Earth. Its explosive power was 6,500 times the power of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The dinosaurs that ruled the Earth and had ruled the Earth for 180 million years before that event, they went extinct. And meanwhile, thousands of asteroids right now continue to orbit the sun. NASA is tracking them over the past 20 years, actually, and assures us that we are good for the next few years, at least. But nobody is saying it can't happen again. Or, Walsh says, the world as we know it could end with the supervolcano blowing its stack. This has happened before, too. The volcano in what is now Indonesia, called Toba, blew its stack 75,000 years ago, and after that volcano blew, the temperature of the Earth dropped 20 to 30 degrees for several years afterwards because the sun no longer shone through the cloud of debris. It brought humans to the brink of extinction. And scientists think that perhaps as few as 2,000 humans, from whom we are all descended, just 2,000 survived in the southern edge of South Africa after that volcano blew. There are still 20 active supervolcanoes in the world today, including Yellowstone Park, which is the nearest one. And on average, these volcanoes have blown about every 25,000 to 50,000 years. The thing is, we're due. Third, Brian Walsh also suggests that we could end the world as we know it through nuclear war. We thought, of course, that nuclear war was no longer a threat when the Cold War was over, but now Putin and Trump, I don't know how we ended up with those two, but Putin and Trump have just canceled the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and things are looking rather more dicey, especially with the news last week that Russia tested a new nuclear weapon that blew up and spread radiation all over a big part of Russia. And the thing is, it isn't just the United States and Russia. There's other nuclear powers that are just chomping at the bit. I mean, India and Pakistan have fought 6 wars in the last 70 years. They both have nukes. Israel has nukes. North Korea has nukes and actually threatens to use them every other day. Iran wants nukes, we think. This week, Turkey threatened that it was going to get nukes too. Fourth, the world could end on account of climate change. Did you know that the 5 hottest years ever recorded by humanity have occurred in the past 10 years? We are seeing more and more horrific tropical hurricanes like Dorian. We've all seen what it did in the Bahamas, what it's doing right now in eastern Canada. And because of climate change, we usually think, well, it's going to get hot, but actually one of the biggest things that's going to happen is that we are going to see massive movements of people from areas in the world that have become too hot to live, too flooded to live, too arid to live. Already, many of the people trying to migrate from Africa to Europe, they're not doing it merely because of war. They're doing it because in countries like Mali, it's too hot and there's no water. Well, I can speak about climate change for a long time, but I won't. Walsh says the end of the world could come through a pandemic. That has happened before, too. Justinian's plague in the year 400 and something. Justinian's plague killed half the world's population. And then 1,000 years later, the Black Death killed 200 million people. New diseases caused by animal infections jumping to humans happen all the time, as in SARS and Ebola. It's almost like there's an annual event every year where we describe some new kind of disease that's affecting humans, and eventually one of them is going to be deadly. Brian Walsh isn't finished. He writes further long chapters about dangers of bioengineered pathogens and terrorism, as in Margaret Atwood's trilogy. He writes about artificial intelligence, about which no less an expert than Stephen Hawking said artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. And he writes, only half seriously now, about the danger of us encountering antagonistic aliens who are invading the Earth. Thankfully, he doesn't get into the threat of vampires or zombies. But, I mean, this was a long stretch of this sermon. How does all this modern doom and gloom make you feel? I mean, do you sleep at night? You know, what I find really frustrating about Walsh's book is that by the end, he says, "Never fear, there is hope." But the thing about his book is that he doesn't explain where that hope comes from. He doesn't anchor it. He doesn't give the readers any concrete scientific reasons to hope. Walsh just says there's hope. He kind of hangs hope out there unsupported, as unlikely as a baby that is somehow managing to hold on to a helium balloon in a heavy wind. In fact, Brian Walsh actually gives us a reason for abandoning all hope. Yeah, and I have to go on in this vein for a little while yet, but this is called scope neglect. Scope neglect explains how humans deal with tragedy, or rather how they usually refuse to deal with tragedy. So when a tragedy is really personal, like in the case of the death or illness of a loved one, it can really overwhelm us, change our lives, it can break us, and it can consume our time and attention and care and concern. But when larger and more extensive tragedies are distant, as in the case of the Bahamas this week, for example, we tend to mostly ignore that tragedy, by which I mean we still sleep well. Ultimately, we carry on as if nothing happened. Scope neglect. So there's a psychologist named Paul Slovic who explains it, and he says, for humans, sympathy can begin to fade as soon as we're presented with two needy people instead of one. This counterintuitive arithmetic of compassion, it makes it hard for us to imagine or to worry about or to empathize with or to even prepare for huge natural disasters. Our brains are wired, our emotions are wired to push such thoughts away and to focus on what's really close by and what we think we can control ourselves. Slovic goes on to say, instead of our worry increasing as the size of the consequences of the tragedy increase, our worry degrades. Our attention is scarce, and so is our ability to worry about anything beyond the strictly personal. So Joseph Stalin understood this. After he had killed 4 million people in the Ukraine through starving them to death, Joseph Stalin is reputed to have said, "A single death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is just a statistic." And that's how it is when it comes to the end of the world and all these threats I've talked about. Scope neglect. We can't get our heads around the consequences of the temperatures, of the nuclear weapons, of the pandemics, of the injustice of terrible regimes, even though the risks that these present to us are very real. The scope is just too large for us to get our heads about, for us to feel. So our brains ignore or actively deny such risks, and we carry on as if they do not exist or make a difference for us. Even the people that we pay to look after the bigger picture, our politicians, maybe some of our corporate leaders, but especially our politicians, they seem to me to be totally paralyzed when it comes to these big issues. Scope neglect, you see, also means that politicians' re-election depends on giving you what you are most emotionally attached to by yourself, individually. And politicians are not geared to giving us all what the world most needs, because that's not what we vote for. One more thing stands out in Walsh's book, something very ironically much more hopeful. He discusses something called the prepper phenomenon. Maybe if you read that book, Educated, you'll know what a prepper is, but preppers are people who prepare for the end of the world privately. They provision themselves with food and survival gear and guns and more guns. And then they hide all this in underground shelters that they set up as places where they can live when the end comes. And they put aside caches of fuel and food and more guns. Preppers plan to survive the end of the world by hiding from it, while living in their shelters with their families and killing everyone who comes nearby and might take their stuff. Preppers. It's actually a very big thing in the United States. But it was Walsh's analysis of the shortcomings of prepper strategy that got my attention, because he writes this. He says, you know, sociologists who study post-catastrophe societies where everything has been destroyed, sociologists who study those societies report that communities actually often grow tighter, like scar tissue that forms over a wound, even as they endure what seems unendurable. What is remarkable about all the past disasters that almost drove humans to extinction is that it was human cooperation that saved them. It was human kindness for the neighbor. It was humans struggling to carry each other's loads, each other's crosses, that got humans through these crises. It is the village that survived, rather than the individual prepper. It is the community that created conditions for survival, not hidden caches of food. Which brings me back to Jesus' predictions about the coming apocalypse. While Jesus certainly got the timing wrong, Jesus also said in the same breath, if any of you want to be my followers, let them deny themselves. Take up their crosses and follow me. Jesus added, those who want to save their life, they're going to lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. The point worth remembering here is that as he faced the end of the world as he knew it, Jesus turned his back on scope neglect by picking up a cross on behalf of others to save their lives rather than his own. As we shall sing in the song after the message, and I'm not getting into here whether Jesus was God or not and all that kind of Trinity stuff, but the song says, God has joined us in life's struggle. Jesus somehow brought God into life's struggles. And Jesus now invites us to do the same, to save other lives rather than our own. You see, cross carrying, Jesus' crucifixion, it was actually not a deeply personal, lonely act. It was a very public yet subversive political act by Jesus, by one person for the many, in the face of societal injustice and theological incompetence and the painful suffering of his Jewish compatriots. Cross-carrying is the invention by Jesus. I know other people thought of it, but at least in our tradition, the invention of Jesus of non-violent resistance, of the sort that changed the world later, much later, with people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. Jesus' cross was his refusal to be influenced by scope neglect and his insistence on doing something for everyone, even if it was personally costly to him. Jesus' cross was his way of saying, We can make a stand when the odds seem impossible, and our stand can make a difference. If not now, then in a generation or two, or maybe even 1,000 years. And the truth is that Jesus' crucifixion did help lay the groundwork for a whole new kind of ethic, a whole new kind of morality that eventually worked to undermine Rome's oppression and change the world that we live in for the better. Scope neglect is for people who refuse to think more deeply about the world than the fact that they have to pay taxes and that there are pleasures they do not want to forgo. But we are not bound by that approach. And I'm not saying you can't have pleasures or you must want to pay great, large amounts of taxes, but we're not bound by those approaches. We can, for the sake of the world, carry each other's crosses, doing whatever it takes, given wherever our hands are with respect to the levers of power that we can influence. But we can carry crosses and do whatever it takes artistically, by what we say on our campuses, or business-wise, by who we choose to hire, or by the kinds of businesses we want to support or invest in. We can do whatever it takes politically by making sure our voices are heard, by making sure we vote, by trying to think not just about our pocketbook or taxes when we go into the voting booth, but trying to think about the whole world. We can do it in our service clubs by the kinds of activities the service club takes on for the good of the city. We can do whatever it takes religiously in our schools to teach our kids the way the world really is, through volunteering, through making donations, which is perhaps maybe all some of us can do that would make a difference. By how we write our Facebook postings, doing whatever it takes to see not only to our own comfort, but in a positive and hopeful way, thinking about what we can do ourselves to contribute to the world's survival. I don't have to do that. It seems so overwhelming in the face of all this kinds of stuff to do something. All I can say is, it does take an act of imagination on the part of each of us to find out where we can get our toe in. And I could come up with lots of ideas, but I'm not going to talk for another 20 or 30 minutes. But it has to be there working in us and in our hearts as we consider how to live. Figuring out what we can do personally takes an act of personal imagination. And whatever we do, it may be costly. It probably ought to be costly. For no generation and no people in the history of the world ever had so much financially to give as ours. But we will do it for the sake of the world we love, for the sake of the world God so loves. We'll do it because Jesus has showed us how. We'll do it because we have kids and grandkids. And if we don't do it with all we have, why should we expect them